I observe the Atlantic Alliance entering terminal phase as European capitals abandon diplomatic restraint in favor of direct economic confrontation with Washington. The warning of a dangerous downward spiral accompanied by threats of tariff retaliation marks the definitive collapse of institutional cooperation that has governed Western relations since Bretton Woods. This represents far more than trade policy disagreement. We witness the systematic destruction of alliance architecture through reciprocal economic warfare between supposed partners. The European response reveals both desperation and fundamental miscalculation about the balance of economic power across the Atlantic. When Brussels threatens tariff retaliation against American pressure, European leaders demonstrate their failure to comprehend how thoroughly integrated their economies have become within American-dominated financial and technological systems. This is not strategic autonomy asserting itself, this is dependency attempting rebellion while remaining structurally subordinate to the system it claims to resist. I analyze how this confrontation exposes the hollowness of European integration as a counterweight to American hegemony. 7 decades of continental unification have created bureaucratic complexity without generating genuine strategic independence from Washington's economic leverage. The European Union's retaliatory capacity remains constrained by the same dependencies that enabled American coercion in the first place: technological subordination, financial system integration, and security architecture reliance that cannot be unwound through tariff policy alone. The timing of European counter-threats proves strategically incoherent, revealing institutional panic rather than calculated response to American pressure. European capitals announce retaliation while simultaneously depending on American military protection, intelligence sharing, and technological platforms for basic governmental functions. This contradiction highlights how European elites have constructed a continental project that enhances rather than reduces vulnerability to external coercion, through the creation of additional complexity without corresponding power. The structural context demonstrates why European retaliation threats carry limited credibility among serious strategic analysts, despite their symbolic significance for continental political unity. European industrial capacity depends fundamentally on American semiconductor technology, software platforms, and financial infrastructure that cannot be replaced through regional alternatives within any meaningful time frame, creating vulnerabilities that persist regardless of trade policy adjustments. Chinese technological substitutes remain under American sanction regimes that European governments lack the institutional capacity to circumvent without risking catastrophic financial isolation from dollar-based clearing systems that define modern international commerce. The dependency architecture proves more comprehensive than most European policymakers publicly acknowledge, extending far beyond traditional trade relationships into the realm of technological sovereignty and financial system integration. European aerospace manufacturers depend on American components and certification systems. European banks require access to Federal Reserve facilities during liquidity crises. European telecommunications networks operate on American-designed protocols and security systems. Each dependency becomes a pressure point when economic confrontation escalates beyond diplomatic protest into actual retaliatory measures. I examine how the dangerous downward spiral metaphor reveals European recognition of systemic breakdown without corresponding understanding of how to arrest the process once reciprocal escalation begins. The spiral accelerates precisely because both sides now understand that economic interdependence has become weaponized dependency rather than mutual benefit, creating incentives for further escalation rather than compromise. Trust, once destroyed through reciprocal coercion, cannot be restored through institutional mechanisms that themselves become instruments of economic warfare rather than cooperation platforms. The historical precedent proves instructive for understanding why current escalation dynamics resist containment through existing alliance management procedures. The Suez Crisis of 1956 demonstrated how American economic pressure could override European strategic autonomy within hours through coordinated financial assault. The 1973 Watergate period showed how European attempts at independent Middle Eastern policy collapsed under systematic American pressure through oil markets and currency manipulation. Each previous crisis established precedents for American dominance that current European leaders seem determined to challenge despite lacking the capabilities that previous generations recognized as essential for successful resistance. European threats of tariff retaliation demonstrate the poverty of continental strategic options when confronted with determined American pressure, backed by structural control over global financial architecture. The European Union lacks coherent mechanisms for economic warfare that do not simultaneously damage European interests, technology transfer relationships, and financial flows that European prosperity fundamentally depends upon. Every retaliatory measure becomes self-punishment disguised as defiance, creating domestic political costs that European leaders cannot sustain indefinitely. The escalation dynamic reveals how alliance relationships transform into adversarial competition when core interests diverge under systemic pressure that existing institutional frameworks cannot accommodate. American demands for European submission to Arctic resource arrangements and trade policy subordination cannot be accommodated within existing sovereignty frameworks without reducing European independence to ceremonial status. European resistance cannot be sustained without capabilities that European integration has systematically undermined rather than enhanced through decades of institutional development that prioritized economic efficiency over strategic autonomy. Both sides discover that partnership was always conditional on American hegemonic dominance remaining unquestioned, creating contradictions that become irreconcilable once that dominance faces systematic challenge. The alliance system's legitimacy depended on mutual benefit narratives that collapse when economic interdependence becomes a weapon rather than a foundation for cooperation. European leaders finally confront what realist analysts have long understood. Partnership with empire means subordination to empire, regardless of diplomatic language or institutional facades. I observe how this crisis accelerates the fragmentation of global economic architecture into competing blocs defined by technological and financial dependencies rather than ideological alignments. European attempts at economic autonomy through tariff retaliation will inevitably drive deeper integration with non-Western systems, particularly Chinese alternatives to American-dominated platforms, creating irreversible strategic realignment that neither side originally intended but both now find unavoidable. The financial dimension proves crucial to understanding why European retaliation remains structurally limited despite rhetorical escalation. European banks hold massive exposure to American debt instruments and dollar-denominated assets that become hostage to Federal Reserve policy during economic confrontation. European corporations depend on American market access and technological licensing that can be terminated through regulatory action faster than European governments can implement retaliatory measures through their cumbersome institutional procedures. Chinese strategic planners observe this transatlantic economic warfare with considerable satisfaction, recognizing unprecedented opportunities for systemic advancement through Western self-destruction. Every European tariff against American products creates market space for Chinese alternatives across multiple industrial sectors. Every American sanction against European institutions drives European capitals toward Beijing's financial and technological systems, accelerating adoption of Chinese payment platforms and infrastructure that create long-term dependency relationships. The Belt and Road Initiative gains strategic momentum through Western alliance dissolution rather than Chinese diplomatic initiative. European participation in Asian infrastructure investment bank arrangements accelerates when traditional Atlantic financial relationships become weaponized. Chinese technological platforms gain European market penetration that would have required decades under normal competitive conditions. Russian strategic analysis proves equally optimistic about transatlantic fragmentation, accelerating European energy and security realignment away from American dominance. European threats of economic retaliation against Washington reduce European credibility as reliable partners in containing Russian influence across Eurasia. European capitals, increasingly alienated from American leadership, become potential partners for alternative security arrangements that bypass NATO's American-controlled command structure. The institutional implications extend far beyond immediate trade policy into alliance system architecture. NATO's Article 5 mutual defense obligations become meaningless when alliance members engage in reciprocal economic warfare that undermines collective security foundations. European tariff retaliation establishes precedents for economic conflict within alliance structures that cannot be contained through existing dispute resolution mechanisms. I analyze three potential trajectories emerging from this dangerous spiral, each carrying profound implications for global order stability. First, escalating tariff warfare that destroys transatlantic economic integration while failing to resolve underlying sovereignty conflicts, creating permanent adversarial relationships between former allies. This pathway leads toward fragmented trading blocs defined by technological dependencies and security arrangements that exclude American hegemonic oversight. Second, European capitulation following unsuccessful retaliation attempts that demonstrate continental powerlessness against determined American pressure, cementing vassalage relationships for decades, while discrediting European integration as a model for regional autonomy. This pathway preserves American hegemony at the cost of European agency and global institutional legitimacy. Third, systemic collapse of Western alliance structures as reciprocal economic warfare triggers broader financial instability that neither side can control, creating opportunities for non-Western powers to reshape global architecture during the resulting chaos. This pathway leads toward multipolar competition without institutional constraints that managed great power rivalry during the American hegemonic period. Each trajectory points toward the same fundamental outcome: the end of the liberal international order as a framework for managing global economic and security relationships, whether through European submission, American isolation, or systemic collapse. The institutional architecture that governed Western prosperity since 1945 dissolves under the pressure of economic nationalism disguised as alliance management. The dangerous downward spiral terminology reveals European recognition that current escalation dynamics cannot be reversed through existing diplomatic mechanisms. The spiral accelerates because both sides understand that meaningful compromise requires fundamental restructuring of power relationships that neither can accept without abandoning core strategic interests. Europe cannot submit to permanent vassalage without negating the European integration project. America cannot tolerate genuine European autonomy without undermining global hegemonic control. This creates a stability trap. Each side's rational response generates counter-pressure that escalates rather than resolves underlying conflict. European retaliation proves American arguments about European unreliability, justifying further pressure. American escalation proves European arguments about American imperialism, justifying further defiance. The cycle becomes self-perpetuating because both sides' actions confirm the other's worst assumptions. I conclude that this represents the definitive breakdown of consensual hegemony in favor of imperial coercion, marking the transition from liberal international order to naked power competition between former allies. European threats of tariff retaliation demonstrate continental recognition that partnership with America has become indistinguishable from subordination to America, through systematic exploitation of dependencies that European integration created rather than resolved. The alliance system dies through internal contradictions that economic interdependence was supposed to prevent but instead amplified. Mutual dependency was supposed to create mutual restraint. Instead, it created mutual vulnerability that becomes mutual coercion when trust collapses under competing strategic imperatives. The dangerous downward spiral accelerates because both sides finally understand the fundamental contradiction. Alliance with America means submission to America, while resistance means isolation from systems that define modern prosperity. This cannot be resolved through reform or compromise, only through fundamental restructuring of global power relationships that neither current leaders nor existing institutions can manage peacefully. European capitals finally confront that 7 decades of integration within American-led institutions created prosperity at the cost of sovereignty, generating dependencies that prove inadequate when confronted with determined imperial pressure disguised as alliance management.